Section 7, page 21. It is the new setting, of course, it shows the stone beautifully, but it looks a little bare to old-fashioned eyes, Mrs. Welland had explained with a conciliatory side glance at her future son-in-law. Old-fashioned eyes? I hope you don't mean my dear. I like all the novelties, said the ancestors, lifting the stone to her small bright orbs, which no glasses had ever disfigured. Very handsome, she added, returning to the jewel. Very liberal. In my time, a cameo set in pearls was thought sufficient. But it is the hand that sets off the ring, isn't it, my dear Archer? And she waved one of her tiny hands, with small pointed nails and rows of aged fat encircling the wrist like ivory bracelets. Mine was modeled in Rome by the great Ferrigiani. You should have May's done. No doubt he will have it done, my child. Her hand is large. It is these modern sports that spread the joints, but the skin is white. And when is the wedding to be? She broke off, fixing her eyes on the archer's face. Oh, Miss Welland murmured, while the young man, smiling at his betrothed, replied, as soon as ever it can, if only you will back me up, Mrs. Mingott. We must give them time to get to know each other a little better, Mamma, Mrs. Welland interposed, with the proper affectation of reluctance, to which the ancestors rejoined. Know each other? Fiddlesticks! Everybody in New York has always known everybody. Let the young man have his way, my dear. Don't wait till the bubbles of the wine. Marry them before Lent. I may catch pneumonia any winter now, and I want to give her the wedding breakfast. These successive statements were received with the proper expression of amusement, incredulity, and gratitude, and the visit was breaking up in a vein of mild pleasantry, when the door opened to admit the Countess Oleska, who entered in bonnet and mantle, followed by the unexpected figure of Julius Beaufort. There was a cousinly murmur of pleasure between the ladies, and Mrs. Mingott held out Ferrigiani's model to the banker. Beaufort, this is a rare favor. In parentheses, she had an odd foreign way of addressing men by their surnames. Thanks, I wish it might happen oftener, said the visitor in his easy, arrogant way. I am generally so tied down, but I met the Countess Ellen in Madison Square, and she was good enough to let me walk home with her. I hope the house will be gayer now that Ellen's here, cried Mrs. Mingott with a glorious effrontery. Sit down, Beaufort. Push up the yellow armchair. Now I have got you, I want a good gossip. I hear your ball was magnificent, and I understand you invited Mrs. Lemuel Struthers. Well, I have a curiosity to see the woman myself. She had forgotten her relatives, who were drifting out into the hall, under Ellen Olenska's guidance. Old Mrs. Mingott had always professed a great admiration for Julius Beaufort, and there was a kind of kinship in their cool, domineering way and their shortcuts through the conventions. Now she was eagerly curious to know what had decided the Beauforts to invite, in parentheses, for the first time, Miss Lemuel Struthers, the widow of Struthers shoe polish, who had returned the previous year from a long initiatory sojourn in Europe to lay siege to the tight little citadel of New York. Of course, if you and Regina invite her, the thing is settled. Well, we need new blood and new money, and I hear she is still very good looking, the carnivorous old lady declared. In the hall, while Miss Welland and May drove on their furs, Archer saw that the Countess Oleska was looking at him with a faintly questioning smile. Of course you know already about May and me, he said, answering her look with a shy laugh. She scolded me for not giving you the news last night at the opera. I had her orders to tell you that we were engaged, but I couldn't in that crowd. The smile passed from Countess Oleska's eyes to her lips. She looked younger, more like the bold brown Ellen Mingott of his boyhood. Of course I know, yes, and I am so glad. But one doesn't tell such things first in a crowd. The ladies were on the threshold and she held out her hand. "Goodbye, come and see me someday," she said, still looking at the archer. In the carriage, on the way down Fifth Avenue, they talked pointedly of Mrs. Mingott, of her age, her spirit, and all her wonderful attributes. No one alluded to Ellen Olenska, but Archer knew that Mrs. Welland was thinking. It's a mistake for Ellen to be seen, the very day after her arrival, parading up Fifth Avenue at the crowded hour with Julius Beaufort. And the young man himself mentally added, "And she ought to know that a man who's just engaged doesn't spend his time calling on married women, but I dare say in the set she's lived in they do. They never do anything else." And in spite of the cosmopolitan views on which he prided himself, he thanked heaven that he was a New Yorker, and about to ally himself with one of his own kind. Chapter 5. The next evening, old Mr. Sillerton Jackson came to dine with the Archers. Mrs. Archer was a shy woman and shrank from society, but she liked to be well informed as to its doings. Her old friend Mrs. Sillerton Jackson applied to the investigation of his friend's affairs, the patience of a collector, and the science of a naturalist, and his sister, Miss Sophie Jackson, who lived with him and was entertained by all the people who couldn't secure her much so after brother, brought home bits of minor gossip that filled out usefully the gaps in his picture. Therefore, whenever anything happened that Mr. Archer wanted to know about, she asked Mr. Jackson to dine, and as she honored 5 people with her invitations, and as she and her daughter Janie were an excellent audience, Mr. Jackson usually came himself instead of sending his sister. If he could have dictated all the conditions, he would have chosen the evenings when Newland was out. Not because the young man was uncongenial to him, in parentheses. The two got on capitally at their club, but because the old anecdotist sometimes felt, on Newland's part, a tendency to weigh his evidence that the ladies of the family never showed. Mr. Jackson, if perfection had been attainable on earth, would also have asked that Mrs. Archer's food should be a little better, but then New York, as far back as the mind of man could travel, had been divided into the 2 great fundamentals groups of the Mingotts and Masons and all their clan, who cared about eating and clothes and money, and the Archer Newland van der Luden tribe, who were devoted to the travel, horticulture, and the best fiction, and looked down on the grosser forms of pleasure. You couldn't have everything, after all, if you dined with the Lovell Mingotts. You got canvasback and terrapin and vintage wines. At Adeline Archer's you could talk about alpine scenery and the marble faun, and luckily the Archer Madeira had gone round the Cape. Therefore, when a friendly summons came from Mrs. Archer, Mr. Jackson, who was a true eclectic, would usually say to his sister, "I've been a little gouty since my last dinner at the Lovell Mingotts. It will do me good to diet at the Adelines." Mrs. Archer, who had long been a widow, lived with her son and daughter in the West 28th Street. An upper floor was dedicated to the Newland, and the 2 women squeezed themselves into narrower quarters below. In an unclouded harmony of tastes and interest, they cultivated ferns in varying cases, made macrame lace and wool embroidery on linen, collected American Revolutionary glazed beer, subscribed to good words, and read odious novels for the sake of the Italian atmosphere. In parentheses, they preferred those about peasant life because of the descriptions of scenery and the pleasanter sentiments, though in general they liked novels about people in society, whose motives and habits were more comprehensible, spoke severely of Dickinson's, who had never drawn a gentleman, and considered Thackeray less at home in the great world of than Bulwer, who, however, was beginning to be thought old-fashioned. Mr. and Miss Archer were both great lovers of scenery. It was what they principally sought and admired on their occasional travels abroad, considering architecture and painting as subjects for men, and chiefly for learned persons who read Ruskin. Miss Archer had been born in England, and mother and daughter, who were as like as sisters, were both, as people said, true Newlands, tall, pale, and slightly round-shouldered, with long noses, sweet smiles, and a kind of drooping distinction, like that in the certain faded Reynolds portraits. Their physical resemblance would have been complete if an elderly embonpoint had not stretched Mrs. Archer's black brocade, while Miss Archer's brown and purple poplins hung, as the years went on, more and more silky on her virgin frame. Mentally, the likeness between them, as Newland was aware, was that complete that their identical mannerisms often made it appear. The long habit of living together in mutually dependent intimacy had given them the same vocabulary, and the same habit of beginning their phases "Mother thinks" or "Janie thinks," according as one or the other wished to advance an opinion of her own. But in reality, while Miss Archer's serene unimaginativeness rested easily in the accepted and familiar, Janie was subject to start and aberrations of fancy welling up from springs of suppressed romance. Mother and daughter adored each other and revered their son and brother, and Archer loved them with a tenderness made compassionate and uncritical by the sense of their exaggerated admiration, and by his secret satisfaction in it. After all, he thought it a good thing for a man to have his authority respected in his own house, even if sense of humor sometimes made him question the force of his mandate. On this occasion the young man was very sure that Mr. Jackson would rather have had him dine out, but he had his own reasons for not doing so. Of course, old Jackson wanted to talk about Ellen Olenska, and of course Mrs. Archer and Janie wanted to hear what he had to tell. All three would be slightly embarrassed by Newland's presence, now that his prospective relation to the Mingot clan had been made known, and the young man waited with an amused curiosity to see how they would turn the difficulty. They began, obliquely, by talking about Mrs. Lamel's Struthers. "It's a pity the Beauforts asked her," Mrs. Archer said gently, "but then Regina always does what he tells her, and Beaufort's certain nuances escape Beaufort," said Mr. Jackson, cautiously inspecting the broiled chop, and wondering for the thousandth time why Mr. Archer's cook always burnt the raw to a cinder. In parentheses, Newland, who had long shared his wonder, could always detect it in the older man's expression of melancholy disapproval. "Oh, necessarily, Beaufort is a vulgar man," said Mrs. Archer. "My grandfather Newland always used to say my mother, 'Whatever you do, don't let that fellow Beaufort be introduced to the girls.' But at least he had had the advantage of associating with gentlemen. In England, too, they say. It's all very mysterious." She glanced at Janie and paused. She and Janie knew every fold of the Beaufort mystery, but in public Mrs. Archer continued to assume that the subject was not one for the unmarried. "But this Mrs. Struthers," Mrs. Archer continued, "what did you say she was, Tillerton?" "Out of a mine, or rather out of the saloon at the head of the pit, then with living waxworks, touring New England. After the police brought that up, they say she lived." Mr. Jackson in his turn glanced at Janie, whose eyes began to bulge from under her permanent lids. There were still hiatuses for her in Mrs. Struthers' past. "Then," Mr. Jackson continued, in parentheses, And Archer saw he was wondering why no one had told the butler never to slice cucumbers with a steel knife. Then Lemuel Struthers came along. They say his advertiser used the girl's head for the shoe polish posters. Her hair's intensely black, you know, the Egyptian style. Anyhow, he eventually married her. There were volumes of innuendo in the way the eventually was spaced, and each syllable given its due stress. Oh well, at the pass we have come to nowadays, it doesn't matter, said Mrs. Archer indifferently. The ladies were not really interested in Mrs. Struthers just then. The subject of Ellen Olenska was too fresh and too absorbing to them. Indeed, Mrs. Struthers' name had been introduced by Mrs. Archer only, that she might presently be able to say, "Anne Newland's new cousin, Constance Olenska, was she at the ball too?" End of the section, page 26.